My husband pushed his chair back from the table and said, "Can we go now? She'll find her way home." Like I was some woman he'd been inconvenienced by, not the wife who had spent 32 years making sure he never had to reach for a thing twice. For one hard second, all I could hear was the clink of silverware from another table and the soft drag of jazz over the speakers. My son did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the little black bill folder in front of him, jaw tight, hand flat against the leather like he had rehearsed where to place it. Danielle sat beside him with that polished smile she wore when she wanted cruelty to pass as confidence. He had already paid for her. He had already paid for Clifton. He had already paid for himself. Then he slid my bill across the white tablecloth toward me like he was moving aside something unpleasant. Danielle gave a small laugh, light and mean. "We're not paying your bill," she said. "Don't be a burden." Divyantinti nodded. Just nodded. I felt something hot move through my chest. Not loud, not wild, just sharp enough to make the room look different. The candles looked colder. The polished glasses looked like props. Even the flowers in the little vase near the bread plate looked staged, like they had all been waiting with them. My name is Dessa Whitfield, and I have lived long enough to know humiliation has a sound before it has words. It sounds like people getting comfortable while they test how much disrespect you will swallow in public. I did not reach for the bill. I sat there with both hands in my lap and looked at my son's face. I kept waiting for something to break in him. A flinch, shame, a last-minute correction. All I saw was weakness, the kind that borrows someone else's nerve because it never built any of its own. Clifton was already halfway turned toward the aisle. Danielle had picked up her purse. Tavian reached for his jacket. Then Andre's floor captain stepped up to the table. He smiled at me first, warm and professional. "Ma'am, forgive the interruption. Chef asked me to let you know he'd still love your thoughts on the spring menu before he sends final food cost projections upstairs. And your accountant called this afternoon. She said it wasn't urgent, only that the quarterly distributions from the group are processing on Thursday." Nobody moved. He glanced politely around the table. "Would you like the kitchen to send anything else out for your guests tonight? It would all be complimentary, of course." I watched the words land. Tavian's face drained first. Danielle's mouth parted, then closed. Clifton went still in a way I had not seen in years. Not confusion, recognition, fear. Right there in the middle of that silence. Let me ask you something simple. Family. Tell me where you're watching from, because I know pain like this does not only visit one address. I lifted my napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and laid it beside my plate. "Thursday is fine," I said. "Tell Chef I'll review the spring menu Friday morning before lunch service." Then I looked down at the check. "And bring me the full bill." "All of it." The captain nodded and took the folder. Danielle looked at Tavian as if he might still rescue her from what she had chosen. He kept staring at me. Clifton finally sat back down, but he did it slowly, like a man realizing the floor under him was not the floor he thought he was standing on. The restaurant was not under my surname. It never had been. I held my hospitality group through layered companies, and I had never seen a reason to explain the architecture of my life to people who benefited from it without respecting it. Clifton knew I had businesses. He never cared enough to learn how large they were. Tavian knew I worked hard. Danielle knew just enough to be curious. None of them knew they had brought me to one of my own tables to make me feel small. When check came, I paid every dollar of it. Not because I had to, because I wanted them to sit there and watch me do it. 18 months before that dinner, my life still looked solid from the outside. Not perfect. I am too grown to confuse routine with perfection. but it held. Clifton still kissed my cheek most mornings on his way out. Tavian still called often enough for me to believe distance hadn't taken root yet. Danielle had just given birth to Aaliyah. And that baby softened everything for a while. At least, that's what I told myself. I was there for everything. Not in the loud, performative way people announce. In the quiet way that keeps things running without needing credit. I kept an overnight bag at their house because newborn nights don't respect schedules. I stocked their freezer with meals labeled by day because Danielle said thinking had become too expensive. I sent grocery money without calling attention to it. When Tavian's car note started colliding with daycare, I covered the difference twice and made sure it never sounded like help. When they found the house they wanted, I stepped in on the down payment the only way I know how. Quietly enough to preserve his pride, firmly enough to make sure they got the keys. That was how I loved. I made things easier and kept moving. Family to me was supposed to feel like shelter, not performance, not leverage, shelter. That is why the early signs didn't just slip past me. They stayed, and I chose to soften them. Danielle had a way of smiling while she measured people. It took me a little time to name it because she never did anything crude. That would have been easy to correct. What she did was finer than that. She would compliment my blouse, then ask where I got it and how long ago, the way some women ask prices without using the word. She would praise my discipline with money, then laugh and say, "I swear, Ms. Whitfield, you probably know what every dollar in this city is doing." Light voice, bright face, small blade. At dinner one evening, while I was bouncing Aaliyah against my shoulder and Tavian was opening a bottle of sparkling cider, Danielle looked around the kitchen and said, "You're always teaching us to build like you. One day, we'll catch up." Tavian smiled like she had praised me. I didn't, because of the word she chose. Build. Not live. Not grow. Build. There is a difference. One is admiration. The other is assessment. She also corrected Tavian in ways that looked harmless until you paid attention long enough to see the pattern. He would start a sentence, and she would finish it. He would answer a question, and she would slide in with, "What he means is..." He laughed it off. So did I at first. A young marriage has its own rhythm, I told myself. Adjustment, stress, ego. A new baby learning how to take up space. But over time, I noticed something quieter. His voice stopped where hers began. At home, Clifton had started changing too, though it took me longer to name it. He carried his phone everywhere, not just out of habit, with intention. Into the laundry room, into the garage. Screen turned down when it rested on the table. Body angled slightly away during calls like he was shielding something without wanting to look like he was shielding it. Once, while we were watching television, he stood up in the middle of a commercial break and stepped outside to answer a call that stopped ringing the moment he opened the door. When I asked who it was, he said, "Wrong number." Too quickly. That kind of speed has its own truth. Tavian's change was quieter, more gradual. He pulled back by inches, showed up late more often, left earlier than he used to. And when you asked him something simple, something that should have come from him without effort, his eyes would move first. Not to think, to check, to Danielle. As if she had become the room's weather and he needed to know what kind of response would be safe before he spoke. I saw all of it. That's the part people misunderstand later. They think betrayal requires blindness. It doesn't. It requires permission, and I gave it, because I believed in preserving peace longer than I believed in questioning what might disturb it. Still, I wasn't careless. When I helped with the house, I had Harold Gaines add one small layer of protection to the paperwork tied to my contribution. Nothing aggressive, nothing controlling, just a quiet safeguard, that would hold if it ever needed to. I didn't mention it, didn't attach emotion to it, didn't expect to use it. At the time, I told myself I was being responsible. Looking back now, I think some part of me already understood something my heart wasn't ready to say out loud. Love is not an excuse to leave every door unlocked. I drove home alone that night with both hands tight on the wheel and my face so still it started to ache. Not once did Clifton call to ask where I was. Not once did Tavian send one of those weak little messages people use when they want credit for concern without the burden of showing any. The silence told the truth faster than words could. By the time I pulled into the driveway, took off my earrings and set my purse on the entry table, I understood something had shifted beyond insult. Humiliation can happen in a moment. What happened at that restaurant had structure. It had timing. It had agreement. The house felt wrong when I walked in, not empty, staged. Like everybody but me had already rehearsed the next scene. I turned on one lamp in the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa without taking off my shoes. The room looked ordinary enough. Folded throw blanket. 2 glasses still in the drying rack. Clifton's reading glasses on the side table. I stared at those glasses a long time. There is something unsettling about how easily a person can leave their ordinary life in plain sight while hiding the part of themselves that matters most. Sleep wasn't coming. I knew that before I even tried. Around midnight, I got up and went to the den. Not with a plan, not even with suspicion fully formed, just instinct. The kind that makes you move before you can explain why. I didn't go looking for secrets. I went looking for inconsistency. The desk still held things we hadn't updated in years. Old folders, a retired tablet, a small stack of papers we had once agreed were temporary, and then never touched again. I powered up the tablet more out of habit than intention. It took longer than it should have to respond, like it had forgotten it still belonged to a household. When it finally opened, it synced automatically. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Not because syncing is unusual, because of what it chose to sync. Calendar entries, shared reminders, fragments of a system that had once belonged to both of us before everything, moved to private phones and separate lives disguised as one. Most of it was outdated. Old travel holds, dentist reminders, a grocery list from a year ago still sitting unfinished like a small, abandoned promise. Then I saw something current. Not obvious, not dramatic, just recent. A calendar block. No names, no description. Just a time window marked twice in the same week. Then again, the following week. Late evening. Same general location tag. One I recognized without needing it spelled out. Downtown. That alone meant nothing. People have meetings, dinners, work. But Clifton hadn't mentioned anything consistent enough to repeat like that. I tapped one of the entries. No details opened. Just the time. And a small notation at the bottom. Confirm before Thursday. I sat there for a second staring at it. Not because it proved anything. Because it didn't fit. I went back and checked older entries. The pattern didn't stretch back years. It wasn't a life. It was recent. A few months, maybe. Enough to be intentional. Not enough to feel permanent. Then I noticed something else. One of the reminders tied to the same time block had been edited more than once. The timestamp showed it. Small adjustments. Minutes shifted. Days nudged. Careful, not sloppy. That mattered. I leaned back slightly, letting the screen dim before tapping it awake again. Still nothing you could take to anyone and say, this is what they did. But that wasn't what I was looking for anymore. I wasn't trying to catch them in a lie. I was trying to understand whether I was standing inside one. I set the tablet down and sat there in the quiet, letting the pieces settle the way they do when your mind stops trying to force them into a story. Dinner, the bill, the way Tavian didn't look at me, the way Danielle spoke like she had already measured the outcome, Clifton's timing, his distance, the repetition on that screen. Not evidence. Alignment. I didn't go digging further. That was the difference between panic and control. Panic searches for everything at once. Control waits for people to keep moving the way they already are. I powered the tablet down and left it where it was. Then I went into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stood there listening to the low hum as it warmed. My hands were steady. That frightened me more than shaking would have, because steady meant I had already crossed out of reaction and into something else. Something quieter. Something harder to reverse. When the tea had steeped long enough, I carried the mug back to the den and sat down again. I didn't open anything else. I didn't need to. Whatever had happened tonight wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a moment. It was part of something that had been moving without me for long enough to become comfortable. And people who grow comfortable inside a lie always make the same mistake. They stop checking who else can see it. I called Harold Gaines at 7:42 the next morning. Not because I was falling apart, because I was done underestimating what had happened. He answered on the second ring, voice rough with sleep but alert almost immediately after he heard mine. Harold had handled enough of my business over the years to know the difference between inconvenience and emergency. I did not waste his time with emotion. I gave him facts: the dinner, the bill, the email thread, the line about my portfolio, the 90-day timeline, Danielle's message, Clifton's language, Tavian's silence. Harold let me finish without interrupting. Then I heard papers shift on his end. "Stay where you are this morning," he said, "and do not call your husband back if he reaches out." He hasn't. A short pause. Not surprise, just confirmation. Then he told me something that changed the temperature of the whole room. Clifton had consulted a divorce attorney 3 months earlier. Quietly. No filing yet. No formal move. Just private consultation, information gathering, position testing. Harold could not give me every detail of another attorney's conversation, but he gave me enough. Enough to know my husband had already been building an exit while still sleeping beside me, eating my food, asking how my day went in that tired little voice men use when they want to sound harmless. I stood at the kitchen counter while he talked and stared out at the backyard. The azaleas along the fence were beginning to turn. I remember that clearly because something in me wanted the world to look different after that sentence, and it didn't. Morning still looked like morning. Birds still moved through the hedge. Betrayal does not always arrive with weather. "I want everything tightened," I said. Harold knew what I meant. Nothing reckless, nothing hidden, nothing that would smell like panic. Just lawful review of ownership layers, signatures, access, control points, exposure. Quiet repositioning before anybody got bold enough to make paper out of greed. By 8:30, I was in my home office with coffee gone untouched beside me, logged into the internal portal for the restaurant group. I did not need to call anyone yet. I knew where to look. Reservation logs are wonderfully honest things. They do not care about loyalty. They do not soften facts. Clifton had dined at my flagship restaurant 4 times in the last 3 months. Private table twice, bar seating once, window section once. Same woman every time. I pulled the scanned guest notes, timestamps, payment records. He had used a card tied to an account we both knew would eventually matter. The woman's name appeared in 2 of the entries because she had once called ahead to adjust the reservation herself. Vanessa Cole. The name meant nothing to me until I searched it through public listings and a professional directory. Local, consultant, polished. And there it was, small, but enough to catch my attention. She had appeared 6 months. Earlier on the attendee list for a hospitality-adjacent industry event Danielle had also attended. That alone proved nothing. But coincidence was getting crowded. I took screenshots and forwarded everything to Harold. His reply came back 12 minutes later. This materially alters his position depending on jurisdiction. Say nothing. Let him keep believing he's ahead. So I did. Then I opened another file request. This one quieter and older. The deed packet tied to the house down payment I had helped Tavian with. I asked for the full copy, including any rider, notation, or secondary attachment Harold had placed at the time. No explanation, no call, just the request. The house was silent around me. Clifton had still not come home. Tavian had still not called. Danielle, I was sure, was somewhere doing what women like her do when a plan appears to be working, mistaking movement for victory. I sat back in my chair and looked at the screen until it dimmed. He had been trying to learn what I owned while drinking wine in one of my own restaurants with another woman on his arm. Nothing makes a man sloppier than believing the woman beside him is already defeated. By that afternoon, I had stopped thinking of the situation as heartbreak and started thinking of it as exposure. Heartbreak is private. Exposure has witnesses. That distinction changed the kind of people I needed around me. Harold Gaines came by first, not with drama and not with pity. Harold had the kind of face that rarely gave anybody what they wanted quickly. He sat at my dining table with a legal pad, a neat stack of printouts, and his reading glasses low on his nose. And he moved through facts the way bricklayers move through weather, steady, practical, uninterested in performance. Do not threaten anybody, he said. Do not warn anybody. Quiet is worth more right now than anger. I know. He looked at me for a beat, then nodded once. That was Harold's version of affection, trusting that I meant what I said. After he left, Brenda Lawson let herself in through the side door, carrying 2 casserole dishes and enough grocery bags to feed a church committee. Brenda had been in my life long enough to know when not to ask too early. She kissed my cheek, set everything down, and said, "You don't have to tell me a thing until you're ready, but you are going to eat." That nearly broke me more than the dinner had. Not because I was fragile, because kindness, when it comes without curiosity, can make a woman realize how long she has been surviving around people who study her instead of loving her. By evening, I met with Victor Hale in my office above the flagship location. Victor was my business partner in the way grown people mean that phrase. Not charming, not flashy, just exact. Numbers sat comfortably on him. So did caution. He already knew enough from the movement Harold had started to understand we were not dealing with a marital spat. We were dealing with risk. "If this gets noisy," he said, looking over the quarterly breakdowns, "lenders will get jumpy, vendors will start asking sideways questions, and staff will feel it before anyone says a word out loud." I looked through the glass wall into the dining room below. Service had started. Servers moved in clean lines. Glassware caught the light. Guests laughed over things that had nothing to do with me. That room represented years of discipline, payroll, patience, standards, second chances, long mornings, ugly spreadsheets, and nights. I came home too tired to take my shoes off before sleep. Men like Clifton always think they are fighting over money. They never understand they are really putting their hands on structure. Andre Mitchell came up last, after dinner service had settled into its rhythm. Andre managed the flagship with the kind of calm you cannot train into people. He either had it or he didn't. And Andre had it. He asked no invasive questions. He only said, "If anything changes operationally, I need to know early enough to protect the floor." That word stayed with me. Protect. Not the business, not the brand. the floor, meaning the people on it. Later that night, after Brenda had bullied me into eating half a plate, and Victor had gone home, Brenda and I sat in my kitchen with tea gone lukewarm between us. She was talking around the edges of old memories, trying to keep me company without crowding me, when she said something so casually she nearly lost it herself. You know, Danielle used to ask the strangest little questions back then. I turned my head. What kind of questions? Brenda shrugged. Nothing you'd clock in the moment. How many locations you plan to open. Whether each one was under the same company. Whether managers had equity. Stuff like that. I thought she was just trying to learn. She laughed once, but it died quickly. I did not laugh with her, because I remembered Danielle's smile at dinner tables, her careful listening, the way she stored details without seeming to. I remembered, too, the equity packet I had reviewed earlier that day, Andre's vesting schedule, his protections, the years he had given me in exchange for a meaningful stake in the future. If Clifton pushed this mess hard enough, he would not just be coming for me. He would be sending tremors through the lives of people who had done nothing except work honestly under the roof I built. By then, I understood something clearly. This was no longer about hurt feelings inside one family. Too many jobs, mortgages, contracts, and futures were tied to what they thought they could pry out of me. The question was no longer whether I would fight. It was how quietly I could do it before they realized the room had changed. Harold called me just before noon and said, "It's enforceable." I was standing in my dressing room with one earring in and one still on the counter, staring at myself in the mirror like I was checking whether I still looked like a woman whose life belonged to her. His words settled something sharp inside me. The protection tied to the money I had contributed for Tavian's house had held. Years earlier, when the purchase papers were being drawn up, Harold had written in one quiet layer of protection linked to my down payment. Not ownership in the loud, vulgar sense people imagine when they hear a mother helped her son. Just a secured interest that stayed attached unless formally released. It never had been. Back then, I signed the check and moved on with my life. I did not bring it up at dinners. I did not wave it around like leverage. I did what women like me have always done when love and prudence have to live in the same body. I handled my business and kept my mouth closed. Now that silence had value. "We can file a lien," Harold said, quietly, cleanly. "It won't put anybody out. It just keeps the property from being used against you. Do it." No trembling, no long speech, just that. By late afternoon, it was done. A lawful marker, a small piece of paper with the power to interrupt other people's assumptions. They could still sleep there, still cook in that kitchen, still tuck Aaliyah into bed under that roof. But the house was no longer a free-moving piece on a board they thought I had left unguarded. That was my first correction. After that, I went still. I left the family group chat without comment. No dramatic exit line, no accusation, no wounded paragraph sent at midnight for people to screenshot and discuss. I stopped initiating. If a message required an answer, I answered briefly. If it did not, I let silence do what rage never could. 2 days later, Tavian called. I was at the office over the flagship location, reviewing invoices with one eye and the city moving beyond the glass with the other, when his name lit up my phone. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey, baby," I said, warm, enough to confuse him. He paused. "Hey, Ma." I could hear Danielle somewhere in the background, not speaking, just present in the air between us the way she always was. He asked how I was. I said I'd been busy. He asked if everything was okay. I said, "Everything's moving." I asked about Aaliyah instead. Had her rash cleared up? Was she sleeping through the night yet? The minute I shifted the conversation toward his daughter, his shoulders seemed to drop through the phone. He wanted normal. Men like Tavian always do. They want access to damage without having to sit inside it. He laughed weakly and told me Aliyah had started throwing her spoon off the high chair just to watch people pick it up. I smiled, because that sounded like her. Then he waited. I gave him nothing else. When we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my hand and imagined the look Danielle must have given him. Not relief, suspicion. She was too sharp to trust quiet. I was right. Later that evening, Andre sent a discreet internal note that someone had been trying to trace the ownership trail behind one of the holding entities connected to the restaurant group. It was not hard to guess who. Danielle had followed one company name just far enough to reach a registered agent at a law firm and then hit a wall. No surname, no easy map, no neat little prize at the end of her curiosity. That told me more than a successful search would have. It told me she felt movement. It told me she knew silence could mean strategy. It told me she was starting to look for the shape of a machine she had never been invited to understand. I leaned back in my chair and looked out over the dining room below, where glasses flashed and servers moved like they belonged to a world built on rhythm and discipline, and standards nobody at my family table had ever respected. Danielle was smart enough to feel the room changing. She just was not close enough to see where the walls were moving from. Good. Let uncertainty keep working on her. Fear makes impatient people careless. Harold spread the file open in front of me without flourish. There are some betrayals that still look unreal even after they have been indexed, highlighted, and arranged by date. You would think paper would make things feel colder. In my experience, it only makes them harder to excuse. Reservation logs sat on the left, charges on the right. Dates, times, and payment records ran down the middle like tracks cutting straight through my marriage, not perfectly aligned, not clean enough to impress anyone at first glance, but steady. Clifton hadn't been foolish enough to rely on one method. That would have been easy to pull apart. Instead, he rotated. Different cards, occasional cash, slight shifts in timing. The kind of variation men convince themselves looks like caution. It doesn't. It just takes longer to read. Harold tapped one page lightly. Some of these charges route back to shared accounts. I looked at the totals and felt something settle in me. Not jealousy. That would have been simpler. Not even heartbreak. It was insult, sharpened into clarity. He had been using the shared architecture of our life to stage another one. Victor sat across from me, hands folded, saying nothing until Harold passed over the background notes. Her name is Vanessa Cole, Harold said. I read the page without reacting outwardly. Local, professionally established. Independent consulting work tied loosely to hospitality operations, vendor optimization, event coordination, short-term advisory contracts. Not hidden, not reckless. Placed. That matters, Harold added, watching me. She operates in spaces adjacent to yours. I looked up slightly. Meaning? Victor asked. Harold slid another page forward. Not conclusions, not speculation. Just compiled references, event attendance lists, vendor meetings, industry panels, not social overlap. Professional. Proximity. Vanessa's name appeared on a vendor advisory panel connected to 2 mid-tier restaurant groups. 3 months later, that same vendor had submitted a proposal to one of my secondary entities. Different channel. Same network. Danielle's name showed up on an attendee list for a hospitality finance workshop hosted by a firm that had previously audited one of our suppliers. Again, separate, but close enough to matter. Then there was one entry that sat differently. A small private networking event. Limited attendance. Mostly consultants, mid-level operators, and a handful of people looking to move into larger circles. Both names appeared on the list. No indication they spoke, no confirmation they met, but no longer strangers to the same rooms either. I sat back slowly. "That's not coincidence," Victor said quietly. Harold didn't rush to agree. "It's not proof of coordination," he corrected. "But it removes distance." That distinction mattered, because distance is where innocence hides. Remove that, and everything else has to be reevaluated. I looked down at the pages again. Clifton's dinners, Danielle's questions, Vanessa's access points. Nothing loud, nothing reckless. Just proximity layered over opportunity. And people rarely need formal introductions when their interests already align. "You're saying they didn't need to plan together," I said. Harold met my eyes. "I'm saying they didn't need to." That landed harder than confirmation would have, because coordination can be broken. Instinct can't. Victor leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "That explains the confidence," he said. I didn't respond, because it did more than that. It explained the tone, the way Danielle spoke at the table, the way Tavian deferred, the way Clifton moved like he had already calculated an outcome. Not because they had one clean plan, but because each of them believed they understood the same thing: me. I closed the file halfway, then opened it again. All those years, shared calendars, utility bills, appointments, repairs, holidays, quiet routines built without needing to be explained. And underneath it, this. Not loud, not dramatic, just consistent enough to exist without asking permission. "You have enough to move," Harold said after a moment. "Not everything, but enough." I didn't answer immediately, because enough depends on what you're trying to do. If I wanted spectacle, I didn't have it. If I wanted certainty, I didn't have that either. But if I wanted position, I had more than they thought. I closed the file gently. "File today," I said. Harold gave one short nod, like he had expected no other answer. Clifton was served the next afternoon outside his office building. No scene, no raised voices, just public enough that it couldn't be rewritten later as misunderstanding. Just visible enough to settle into his body before he had time to prepare a response. His calls started within the hour. The first came while I was at my breakfast table the next morning. Though breakfast was the wrong word for a cup of coffee I had let go cold while reviewing staffing notes. Then another. Then another. By the 6th, the sound had changed. Not urgency, offense. By the 11th, it had shifted again. Something closer to fear. Brenda, standing at my stove with a kettle in her hand, glanced over at the phone, lighting up again and again. "You going to answer that?" I wrapped both hands around my mug and watched his name appear, disappear, then return. "Not today," I said. I let it ring until it stopped. Then again. Then again. That was the moment the balance shifted for real. Up until then, Clifton still believed he was moving around me, planning around me, reading me, positioning himself for a future he had already started spending in his head. He thought divorce would be the beginning of my panic. Instead, it became the first official record that I had moved before he was ready. Gloria Jenkins called me a little after 3 in the afternoon and said, "Baby, I think your daughter-in-law just came over here to study me." I was in my office above the flagship location, halfway through a staffing report, and the way she said it made me put the paper down immediately. Gloria had lived 3 houses down from us for almost 20 years, long enough to know who watered roses out of habit, who waved only when other people were watching, and who knocked on doors carrying smiles that did not match their purpose. She was not dramatic. That is why I listened carefully when she was. "What happened?" I asked. "She came by with banana bread from that little bakery on Mercer," Gloria said. And that girl does not love me enough to bring me pastries on a Tuesday. Despite everything, that almost made me smile. Gloria told me Danielle had arrived polished and gentle, soft voice, careful eyes, carrying concern like a church fan she wanted credit for holding. She said she had been worried about me, worried I was struggling, worried the divorce had made me unstable, worried I might start making rash decisions out of hurt. It was the language that caught Gloria first, not the words themselves, the shape of them. Danielle was too polished to accuse me outright. She circled instead, mentioned pressure, mentioned stress, mentioned how women from another generation sometimes tied identity too tightly to control. She talked about money in the careful way people do when they want to sound above it, while revealing they think about little else. She said older women panic when access starts slipping. Said family businesses often become messy when emotions get involved. Then she asked, lightly, like she was commenting on the weather, whether Gloria had noticed me seeming disoriented lately. Disoriented. Gloria repeated that word to me with such disgust I could hear her upper lip curl through the phone. She wasn't asking because she cared, Gloria said. She was fishing. I leaned back slowly in my chair and looked through the glass wall into the restaurant below. Lunch had thinned. A server was resetting a two-top near the window. Somewhere downstairs, dishes touched and parted in the soft rhythm of a room trained to keep moving no matter what people bring into it. "What did you say?" I asked. "The truth," Gloria said, "which is that I mind my business until somebody insults my intelligence in my own living room." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Then she slowed down, and I knew we had reached the part that mattered. "She got comfortable," Gloria said. That made my fingers tighten slightly around the phone. "Not stupid," Gloria added quickly. "Don't mistake me. That girl is not careless, but she got confident." I said nothing. "When I didn't react the way she expected," Gloria continued, "she shifted, stopped performing concern so hard, started talking like she assumed I already agreed with her." I closed my eyes for a moment. That tracked. "What kind of talking?" I asked. "The kind where people don't say the whole thing," Gloria said, "but they say enough pieces that you can see what they believe." She told me Danielle started speaking more plainly about pressure, about how situations like this usually resolve themselves once people understand what they're up against, about how older women sometimes mistake control for stability, about how access changes things, even when people don't want to admit it. She kept coming back to that word without saying it directly, Gloria said. Access. I could hear it clearly in my head. Danielle's voice, soft, reasonable, never raising itself high enough to sound like an accusation. "What else?" I asked. "She asked questions she shouldn't have needed to ask," Gloria said. "About how involved you still are day to day, about who makes final decisions when you're not there, about whether things slow down when you step back." That wasn't curiosity. That was mapping. I stood up from my chair and walked to the glass, watching the last of the lunch crowd settle their bills. "And you?" I asked. "I gave her nothing she didn't already know," Gloria said, "and I made sure she knew I knew what she was doing." That almost made me smile again. There was a pause on the line, then Gloria added, "Quieter this time." "I didn't record her." I said nothing, waiting. "But I wrote it down," she continued. "Soon as she left, everything I could remember. The words, the order, the way she said it. You know how I am." I did. Gloria had a memory for tone, for intention, for the shape of conversations that tried to pass as harmless. "It's not proof," she said plainly. "Not the kind you wave around, but it's direction." That word sat right where it needed to. direction. Not evidence, not victory, but confirmation that what I had been feeling had a structure outside my own head. She thought I was one of those older women who hear the words modern marriage and start apologizing for having standards, Gloria said. She chose the wrong porch. I let that sit for a second before speaking. Write it up clean, I said. Dates, timing, anything that stood out. Send it to Harold. Oh, I already started, she said. Then, after a small pause, and Dessa, yes? She is too comfortable. After we hung up, I stood there a long moment with the phone still in my hand. Danielle hadn't made a mistake the way careless people do. She hadn't confessed anything. She hadn't slipped into stupidity. What she had done was more subtle than that. She had revealed how she thinks. And that was enough. Because people who believe they understand the room better than everyone else eventually stop checking where the doors actually are. The first real hit did not come with shouting. It came in the form of a motion filed on a Thursday morning and forwarded to Harold before I had finished my coffee. He called me within 10 minutes. They're alleging concealment? I was standing in my office with my jacket still on, handbag hanging from one shoulder, reading his email from my phone while the city moved below the windows like nothing in the world had changed. Concealment, asset shifting, layered hospitality entities being used to move marital money out of reach. It was aggressive, thin in places, and ugly in the way only legal language can be when somebody is trying to turn complexity into suspicion. What are they leaning on? I asked. An old internal transfer between operating accounts, he said. Lawful at the time. Documented. But they're framing it like a shell. Game! I closed my eyes for half a second. That transfer had happened 18 months earlier during a vendor restructure. Clean, approved. Ordinary to anybody who actually understood how a multi-location business breathes. But ordinary things become sinister very quickly once greed hires language. By noon, one of the accounts tied to a secondary operating channel had been flagged for additional review. Not frozen, not seized, nothing dramatic enough to justify panic. Just slowed. Payments taking longer to clear. Questions arriving with too much politeness in them. A vendor I'd worked with for years called to touch base. And sounded like a man trying to see whether his confidence should be rented month to month. Then Victor texted me. Hearing chatter. Small for now. But it's moving. That was the first moment I understood what public erosion sounds like before collapse. It is not one loud crack. It is the low spread of uncertainty. A delay here. A look there. Someone. Repeating that there may be issues. With the soft pleasure people take in getting close to trouble without stepping in it themselves. I got through the day because there were still things that needed signing. Payroll still cared nothing for betrayal. Deliveries still had to be confirmed. Andre came upstairs twice with updates and did not once let concern turn into noise. That steadied me more than he probably knew. By the time I got home, the house felt too neat. Brenda had left food on the stove and gone without pressing me to talk. The kindness of that sat in every room like a witness. I stood in the kitchen with one hand on the counter and the other still holding my phone, and for the first time since the dinner, something in me gave way. Not loudly. I did not throw dishes. I did not slide to the floor in a dramatic heap the way television teaches people grief should look. I just bent over the sink and pressed my palm against my mouth because I could feel a sound trying to come out that I had no intention of sharing with the walls. I stayed like that until the wave passed. Then Brenda came back. She had forgotten her keys earlier, or maybe she had felt something in the air and decided to trust it. Either way, when she saw my face, hers changed too. "There's something I should have told you before," she said. We sat at the kitchen table, the overhead light too bright, her hands wrapped around a mug she did not drink from. She told me that years ago, before she understood what Danielle was, she had answered a few questions that seemed harmless at the time. Nothing dramatic. Danielle asking how many locations sat under the same umbrella, whether I kept a regular office schedule, whether managers had any real stake in the business or just titles meant to flatter. I thought she was trying to learn, Brenda said, and the shame in her voice made it impossible to stay angry cleanly. It was not catastrophic information, not by itself, but it was enough to start a map if somebody was patient and hungry enough to draw one. That was the hurt of it. Not just that Danielle had planned, that she had built her understanding of my life through people who loved me and did not know they were holding the flashlight. I reached across the table and put my hand over Brenda's before she could apologize again. I didn't fall that night. I just finally saw how many hands had been touching the edges of my life while smiling in my face. I stopped reacting on Monday morning. That was the difference. Up until then, every move I had made had been necessary, measured, defensive in the cleanest sense of the word. Important? Yes. Smart? Yes. But still made in answer to something ugly that had already been set in motion by other people. Monday was the first day I moved because I decided the timing was right. Victor came into my office at 9 with 3 folders, a black pen, and the face he wears when numbers have stopped being abstract. Harold joined us 20 minutes later by speakerphone. Andre came in last, fresh off the floor, tie loosened, notebook in hand. Nobody wasted language. That alone calmed me. When the room matters, serious people get quieter. The timing isn't perfect, Victor said before he even sat down. I looked at him. It never is, I replied. He didn't argue that, but he didn't soften either. If we push restructuring now, he continued, it'll hold legally, but people will notice the shift. Vendors, lenders, maybe even staff. It won't look like routine anymore. There it was. Friction. Not a reason to stop, but a cost to account for. Harold's voice came through the speaker, steady as ever. He's right. This move protects you, but it also draws a line. Once it's done, you can't pretend nothing is happening. I'm not pretending, I said. Silence, brief and acknowledging. Andre leaned forward slightly, pen resting against his notebook. What does it change on the floor? He asked. That was the right question. Not legal exposure, not optics, reality. Nothing visible, I said. Not if we do it right. If, he repeated quietly. I held his gaze. We will. The restructuring had been under discussion for months already. Not because anything was wrong, but because healthy businesses evolve before trouble forces them to. What we were doing now wasn't new, but the timing was. That changed how it would be read. I went through every page again. Slower this time, not just looking for accuracy, looking for pressure points, every signature block, every transfer of authority, every small sentence that turned vulnerability into structure. Twice, I paused. Once on a clause that shifted approval authority faster than I liked. Once on a reporting line that would tighten oversight enough for someone to feel it. Adjust that, I said, sliding the page toward Victor. I don't want anyone feeling a sudden choke point. He nodded, made a note. We weren't just building protection. We were managing perception. That was the difference between control and panic. When I finally signed, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like weight settling into the right place. Victor watched me cap the pen. This gives us a harder shell, he said. It needs to, I replied. No magic, no dramatic rescue. Just a move that worked because it had already been considered before anyone forced my hand. By lunchtime, the conversation started. Not announcements, not speeches dressed up as leadership, just adjustments. Andre, first. We stood near the private tasting room while lunch service gathered pace outside the glass. He had that same calm look on his face, but I could see what he was carrying underneath it. The weight of staff schedules, payroll questions, supplier nerves, and something else. Concern, not fear. Concern meant he was still thinking clearly. "Is this going to ripple?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. "How far?" "Not past what we can manage." That was the most honest answer I had. He studied me for a second, then let out one controlled breath. "All right. I'll keep the floor steady." "That's what I need," I said. The investor call came next. Short, direct, not entirely comfortable. One of them asked more questions than usual. Another went quiet in the way people do when they're recalculating risk in real time. I gave them what they needed. Not reassurance, clarity. By early evening, the noise hadn't disappeared. It had changed. Less speculation, more attention. That was expected. Harold called while I was still at the office. "We pulled more on Tavion," he said. I sat down slowly. It wasn't criminal, not dramatic, just strain. More debt than he had ever admitted. Pressure at work, a title that looked better from the outside than the salary did underneath. Credit stretched thin, trying to maintain a lifestyle that had quietly outgrown his capacity to support it. He wasn't just arrogant, he was cornered. That didn't excuse him, but it explained how easily another person's ambition could wear his face. An hour later, Harold called again. This time, his tone had shifted slightly. "Vanessa reached out," he said. I didn't speak. "She didn't offer much," he continued, "and she didn't volunteer. We had to knock first." That mattered. "What changed?" I asked. "She's been contacted," Harold said. "Not formally, but enough to understand she's now adjacent to something she can't ignore." "Is she cooperating?" A pause. "She's careful." That told me everything. No sudden loyalty shift, no convenient confession. Just a woman recalculating her position now that the situation had moved closer to her door. "She confirmed a few dates," Harold added. "Nothing we didn't. Already suspect, but enough to tighten the timeline." That was all I needed. Not a witness, not a partner, just alignment. By the time I left the office, the city had gone gold around the edges. The windows of the dining room held the last of the evening light. And for a moment I stood there watching staff move through a service I had spent years building. It wasn't untouched, but it was holding. That mattered. Because for the first time since the dinner, I wasn't reacting to damage. I was deciding what survived it. And that clarity brought something with it I hadn't felt in days. Not relief, control. My job was not to destroy anybody. My job was to stop standing between them and the consequences of what they had already chosen. The truth about Danielle didn't arrive loudly. It arrived the way certain kinds of truth always do. Quiet enough to be dismissed if you weren't paying attention. Precise enough to stay if you were. Harold sent the first batch of Awanam records just after lunch. Flagged. Not explained. That was his way when he wanted me to see something instead of being led to it. I printed them. Some things don't belong on a screen. They need weight, space, the ability to sit in front of you long enough to make you uncomfortable. At first glance, it looked like nothing. Reimbursements, small transfers, routine household crossings, the kind of financial movement that lives inside families without anyone asking too many questions. Because asking would mean admitting you're watching. $28, $112, $53, rounded amounts, clean entries, no drama, nothing large enough to trigger review, nothing reckless enough to feel like theft. I almost set the stack aside, almost. Then I noticed something that didn't belong, not the numbers, the sources. A reimbursement labeled as household supplies, tied to a vendor that didn't supply households. A small transfer categorized as childcare support, processed through an account that had no business handling personal expenses. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they asked a question. Why move small personal amounts through structured channels that already required justification? I pulled one page back, then another. This time, I wasn't looking at the amounts. I was looking at the path. Where the money started, where it paused, where it ended. That's when the friction showed itself. Not everywhere, not cleanly, but often enough to matter. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard in my office, marker already in my hand before I realized I'd picked it up. I didn't map everything, just the entries that felt deliberate. A reimbursement routed through a vendor account the same week Tavian mentioned being short on something small. A transfer that passed through 2 internal points before landing somewhere it could have reached directly. A pattern of using legitimate structures to carry illegitimate convenience. I stepped back. At first, it looked like nothing. That was the hardest part. Because the mind wants a straight line, a clean accusation, a story you can say out loud without explaining how you got there. This wasn't that. So I went back to the table, sat down, read again. Slower this time. Not asking, what is this? Asking, what kind of person does this? That was when it shifted. By the third pass, I saw how often the same routing behavior appeared. Not constantly, not predictably, but consistently enough to avoid coincidence. By the fifth, I noticed the positioning. Not large enough to raise alarms, not frequent enough to establish a pattern on first review, but placed around moments of pressure, when cash was tight, when timing mattered, when asking directly might have required permission. By the seventh, I stopped thinking in terms of mistakes. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the pages spread out in front of me. It wasn't a straight line. There were gaps, noise, entries that meant nothing. But the structure around them was clear. This wasn't someone taking. This was someone testing movement. Victor came in halfway through and stood across from me, looking down at the paperwork without touching it. "You see it?" he asked. "Not all of it," I said, "but enough." He nodded slowly. "That's usually how it starts." I slid one page toward him, then another. He didn't rush, didn't interrupt. Just stood there long enough to understand the shape without forcing it into a conclusion. "It's not big money," he said after a moment. "No, but it's deliberate." That was closer to the truth than anything we had said out loud so far. He straightened slightly. "You want me to pull deeper?" I held his gaze for a second, then shook my head. Not yet. Because this wasn't about proving a crime. Not yet. This was about understanding intent. After he left, I sat there alone again. And that was when the harder part settled in. Not the numbers, the meaning behind them. I thought of the dinner table, Danielle tilting her head, asking neat little questions about growth and structure, like she was studying something she planned to use later. I thought of the way she finished Tavian's sentences, steering him so smoothly he never noticed the direction changing. I thought of Gloria's voice, calm, unimpressed, repeating Danielle's language back to me. Pressure, access, control. It was all the same instinct, just wearing different forms. I picked up one of the pages again and looked at a line that, on its own, meant nothing. That was when it settled completely. Danielle wasn't stealing. She was learning how far things could move without consequence. Small shifts, measured, repeated just enough to build confidence, not enough to collapse anything, just enough to ensure she would never be trapped inside of structure she didn't control. I sat back slowly. That kind of thinking doesn't happen by accident. It's built. over time. Tavian came into my mind then, not as the man at the dinner table, but as the boy he had been. Open, eager, wanting approval before he understood what it cost him. Somewhere along the way, that part of him had learned to lean instead of stand. He hadn't built this, but he had made it easy to build around him. That truth didn't make him innocent. It made him usable. And that landed heavier than anything else I had seen that day. I stood up and walked to the glass, looking out over the dining room below. Lunch had thinned to a few quiet tables. Andre was near the host stand, speaking to a server with his usual calm. The room held, disciplined, earned. I had spent years building things that could carry weight. Danielle had spent years learning where weight could be shifted without anyone noticing. I went back to the table and stacked the papers neatly. Slower this time. There were still gaps, still questions, still enough uncertainty to make a courtroom argument messy. But I didn't need perfect. I needed direction. Tavian would need to see this, not now. Not while confusion could still protect him. But later, when there would be nowhere left to look but straight at it. I clipped the pages together and slid them into the folder Harold had prepared. For all the time they had spent studying me. They had never considered I might learn how to read them the same way. By the time Harold called that morning, I already knew what kind of day it was going to be. There is a quiet that settles over things right before they tighten. Not panic, not chaos. Just a narrowing, like everything unnecessary is about to fall away. "Come in," he said. "Bring nothing but yourself." I met him at his office an hour later. No dramatics, no waiting room tension, just a straight walk into a conference space where the blinds were half drawn and the table was already set with folders arranged in a clean line. Harold sat at the head, glasses low, pen resting across a legal pad he hadn't touched yet. Clifton was already there. That was the first shift. He did not look at me when I walked in. He stared at the table like it might rearrange itself into something he could understand if he waited long enough. His shoulders were tight, not angry, not confident. Tight in the way people get when they feel something closing in and can't find the door. I took my seat without greeting him. Harold began without preamble. "They've made allegations of concealment and improper transfer," he said calmly. "We're going to address those now. No raised voices, no performance, just pressure applied evenly." He started with the transfer. The same one Clifton's attorney had tried to stretch into something suspicious. Harold laid out the timeline. Vendor restructuring, documented approvals, standard operational movement across accounts tied to growth, not concealment. He slid one sheet forward, then another, then another. Each one narrowing the space Clifton's claim had to stand. Clifton shifted in his chair. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. Harold didn't look at him. He moved next to the account scrutiny, the temporary slowdown, the quiet questions that had started moving through vendors and contacts like low smoke. He answered them the same way. Clean records, clear intent, no deviation from lawful practice, nothing hidden, nothing rushed, nothing that matched the story Clifton had tried to build. I watched Clifton's hands. That is where truth lives when words are still pretending. His fingers tightened against each other, then loosened, then tightened again. A man trying to hold on to a version of reality that was slipping in small, precise pieces. Then Harold placed the email thread on the table. Not with drama, just there. Clifton's eyes moved over it once, then again. Slower. He knew what he was looking at. There is a difference between being accused and being confronted with your own language. One invites argument. The other removes it. The room went quiet for a few seconds that felt longer than they were. Harold let that silence do its work. Then he added the last piece. A summary of financial patterns uncovered in recent review. Not an accusation thrown across the table. Not a performance. Just a structured presentation of movement that did not belong where it had been placed. Enough to show design. Enough to suggest intent. Enough to make it very clear that the story Clifton had been trying to tell about me could not survive in a room where everything was being read in full. Clifton looked up then. At me. Really looked. Not the way he had at dinner. Not the way he had when he thought I was something to manage. This was the look of a man finally seeing the shape of the room he was in. You moved. First, he said quietly. It was not a question. I held his gaze. I moved correctly, I said. That was all. No explanation, no lecture, no attempt to help him understand something he had chosen not to understand for months. Harold closed the folder. That addresses the allegations, he said. We'll proceed accordingly. Proceed accordingly. Clean words for a messy collapse. Clifton leaned back slowly, like the chair had lost some of its support. For the first time since I had known him, he looked not smaller exactly, but stripped. Like whatever he had been building in his head had finally been forced to stand in the light without decoration. He had spent months constructing a case against me. And in less than an hour, it had nowhere left to stand. I stood up before he did. Not abruptly. Not in a way that made the moment about leaving. Just finished. By the time I reached the door, I understood something with a clarity I had not needed before. He had not lost because I was louder. He had lost because everything he had built depended on me not knowing what I was looking at. Tavian came 5 minutes early and still managed to look like a man arriving late to his own life. I had asked him to meet me in a private dining room at the flagship before lunch service began. Neutral ground, quiet walls, no audience, no chance for Danielle to interrupt, redirect, or perform concern from across a doorway. Just a table, 2 chairs, a carafe of water neither of us touched, and the kind of silence that forces truth to sit up straight. When he walked in, he did not hug me. He did not smile either. Ma, he said carefully, like the word had edges on it. I nodded toward the chair across from me. Sit down, Tavian. He sat, but only halfway, his body still carrying the restless tension of someone hoping this might somehow remain a misunderstanding if he looked uncertain enough. His eyes moved once around the room, then back to me. I could see Clifton in him then, not in the face, but in the instinct, looking for exits before facts. The folder was already on the table between us. He looked at it. What is this? The truth, I said. That made him flinch harder than anger would have. For a second, he did what weak men always do when they feel something larger than them approaching. He tried softness. If this is about Danielle, she said you've been trying to open it. My voice was quiet. That was enough. He opened the folder slowly, like paper itself might accuse him before he finished unfolding it. The first pages were the emails. Not all of them. Just enough. His father's language, his own replies. Danielle copied in, then Danielle writing the line that had sat in my bones ever since I read it. If she cries and apologizes, she's manageable. If she stays calm, we've got a bigger problem. His mouth tightened. That's not. It is. He went still and kept reading. The next section was the reservation record and the spending trail. Dates, times, the same woman. Charges tied back to shared money. He looked at those longer than I expected. Not because the affair surprised him, because seeing it reduced to proof stripped it of every excuse he might have borrowed from his father. Then came the financial review. Not every page, Not enough to drown him, just enough to make the pattern visible. Quiet little redirections. Reimbursements that leaned where they shouldn't. Timing that repeated too neatly to be accidental. Danielle building a private cushion while telling him whatever she needed to tell him to keep him pointed in my direction. He stopped there. Actually stopped. The room changed when it happened. His shoulders dropped first. Then his face did something I had not seen since he was a boy, and realized he had broken something he couldn't put back together. He looked up at me, but not fully. Shame has its own posture. "You knew," he said, but it came out thin. "All this time, you knew." I knew enough. His breathing turned shallow. He sat back and pressed one hand over his mouth, staring at the pages as if they might rearrange themselves into a kinder version of him if he waited long enough. "She told me." He stopped. I did not help him. That was the point of this meeting. Not to rescue him through his collapse, not to give him nicer language for what he had done, just to let him sit in a room where the truth had no competing voice. When he finally spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "I thought you were trying to control everything." I held his eyes then. "No," I said. "I was the only one in your life not taking from you." That landed clean. He folded in on himself after that. Not theatrically. No falling to his knees, no dramatic begging, no cheap apology speech. Just a grown man coming apart quietly because he had finally run out of people to blame faster than himself. I let him feel every second of it. This wasn't about destroying my son. It was about making sure he finally understood who never did. The end of a thing rarely sounds dramatic while you are living through it. Most times, it sounds like paperwork being finalized, keys changing hands, and people learning, too late, that consequences do not arrive the way they imagined them. Not as thunder, not as collapse, but as quiet adjustments that leave no room to return to who you were before. Clifton settled for less than he had built his appetite around. Not nothing. But not the life he had already started spending in his head either. By the time the divorce terms were finalized, the spending patterns, the inconsistencies, the timing, and the attempt to reshape me into something unstable had narrowed his position down to what could actually be defended. Not what he wanted, not what he believed he deserved, just what could hold under scrutiny. He signed without looking at me. That part stayed with me. Not because it hurt, because it told the truth. Men who believe they are right hold eye contact. Men who know they have miscalculated look for exits that aren't there. He left with his personal belongings, a modest settlement, and the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from realizing the version of yourself you were building has already collapsed before anyone else had time to believe in it. He moved in with Vanessa. That part didn't surprise me. What did was how quickly it ended, not with shouting, not with betrayal layered on top of betrayal, just exposure. There is a difference between a relationship built in secrecy and one forced to exist in daylight. In secrecy, imagination does half the work. In daylight, reality asks for proof. 3 months later, they were done. No scandal, no explanation, just distance. Two people who had made sense inside a controlled version of each other, finding very little to stand on when everything had to be real. By the time I heard about it, he had already moved out. Smaller place, different part of town, not ruined, just reduced to what he could actually sustain. Danielle lasted longer. Women like her don't leave until every version of the room has been tested. Tavian confronted her privately. He told me that much later, carefully, like the memory still required handling. He didn't bring everything. That would have been noise. He brought enough. Enough records to make the pattern visible. Enough structure to remove confusion. Not enough to humiliate her. That mattered. Because humiliation invites performance. Clarity forces stillness. She didn't panic, he told me. I know, I said. Because Danielle wasn't reckless. She adjusted. First came explanation. Clean, measured, framed as survival. As if small manipulations were simply the cost of navigating a world that didn't offer enough. Then came irritation. At him. At timing. At the idea that he had chosen this moment to question something she had already decided made sense. When that didn't move him, she shifted again. Blame. Then tears. Not loud. Not uncontrolled. Just enough to reopen a door that had always worked before. But something in him had already shifted. Not completely. Not cleanly. Just enough. He stayed seated. That was the difference. He didn't argue well. Didn't deliver a speech. Didn't become a man overnight. He just stopped stepping backward. And when she realized that, the room changed. He asked her to leave. Not loudly. Not with victory. Just the way a person closes a door after realizing the room on the other side has been costing too much for too long. Legal action was discussed, quietly. Documents reviewed, accounts separated, repayments structured where they could be traced cleanly. No courtroom performance. No public unraveling. Just consequences built in a way that would hold after the moment passed. Danielle left for her mother's home in another city. From what filtered back, through people who always know more than they should, she told her version the way people like her always do. Controlled, edited. She said the marriage had been damaged by interference. That pressure had come from the outside. That things might have worked if she had been left alone to manage them properly. It was a better story than the truth. And easier to live inside. Tavian was left in the middle of what remained. 34 years old. A daughter to raise. Debt to untangle. A version of himself he had to meet without help. He started therapy again. Not the kind people use to sound like they're improving. The kind that asks questions he couldn't answer quickly. He called more, not out of habit, not out of guilt, but because silence had stopped protecting him. Sometimes the calls lasted an hour, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes just long enough to say he had made it through the day without pretending. I didn't rush that. Trust doesn't come back because someone asks for it. It returns when it has somewhere steady to land. Then came the part that reached under everything else. Weeks after Danielle left, Aaliyah said something to him at bath time while he was rinsing shampoo from her hair. He told me later she said it in that soft, matter-of-fact way children use when they believe something is simply true. "Grandma busy now," she said. "Grandma don't want me no more." He asked where she heard that. She shrugged. "Splashed the water once. Mama said." He called me that night at 10:07. I saw his name and almost let it ring. Not out of anger, out of exhaustion, but something in me tightened before I could decide. So I answered. "Hello." There was breathing on the other end first, then his voice. Rough, smaller than I had ever heard it. "Mama," he said. I closed my eyes. He hadn't called me that in 2 years. Then he said, "She thinks you don't want her." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I understood exactly what had been done, not to me, to her. I set the phone down on the counter and pressed my hand against it, steadying myself before I picked it back up. Some consequences arrive in courtrooms, some arrive in silence, and some arrive in the voice of a child, repeating something they should have never been taught to believe. A year later, I was standing in a hard hat and low heels in the middle of a room that still smelled like sawdust, fresh paint, and possibility. The new location was still weeks away from opening, but I could already feel its rhythm. The bar top had just been sealed that morning, smooth under my palm when I ran my hand across it. Light came in clean through the front windows around 5 in the evening, catching the brass fixtures and warming the wood in a way that told me dinner service would be beautiful in that room if the music was right and the staff knew how to move. The architect was saying something about final trim options, and I listened. But part of me was already setting tables in my mind, already hearing glasses touch softly and people settling into a place built to hold them well. That is who I have always been. Not a woman made by what she survived. A woman made by what she could still build afterward. Some things had repaired themselves slowly enough to feel honest. Sunday lunches with Brenda and Gloria had become a standing habit, the kind that does not need a formal invitation anymore. One of them brings dessert, the other brings opinions, and both bring enough energy to turn a quiet meal into a full afternoon. We argue about recipes, church politics, who look tired at service and why, and laugh hard enough sometimes that I have to put a hand over my chest and tell them not to make me ruin my lipstick. The trust between us was not fixed in one grand conversation. It came back the way real things do, by showing up again and again until the wound stopped leading every room. Tavian called every week, not out of duty, not because guilt had nowhere else to go, because he was learning, slowly and with more pain than pride, how to tell the truth without dressing it up. Some calls lasted an hour, some lasted 5 minutes. He was seeing a different therapist now, one he chose for himself. No borrowed language, no performance. Just the long work of becoming somebody sturdier than the man who had once sat across from me, needing another person to tell him what reality was. I did not rush that healing. Neither did he. Aaliyah came every other Saturday. We cooked simple things together because children trust repetition more than spectacle. Pancakes, biscuits, banana bread if she was patient enough to mash properly and not just artistically. She stood on a little step stool at my counter, serious as a judge about measuring cups, flour on her cheek more often than not. Every drawing she made for me went straight to the refrigerator with a magnet. One afternoon, she stood there studying them all, head tilted, and asked, "Grandma, why you keep so many of my pictures?" I was stirring something on the stove when she asked it. I looked over at her and said, "Because everything you make is worth keeping." She accepted that immediately. Children know truth when it comes without strain. The magazine profile came out in early spring, a respected regional publication, not gossip, not scandal, business, legacy, leadership. They wanted the story of the restaurant group, how it had grown, what it meant to build something lasting without turning yourself into a spectacle. I agreed on my terms, my voice, my framing. For the first time, my name sat in public beside the full shape of what I had quietly built all these years. I read the article at my usual table in the flagship. Fresh flowers were waiting there, as always. The chef sent out a dish I had not ordered because he wanted my opinion before putting it on the summer menu. The dining room was full. The jazz was low and easy. The light was exactly right. I ordered my favorite meal. When the check came, I picked it up and paid it without a second thought. Because I always could. Because I always did. And now, finally, everybody knew it.